There's a moment that happens quietly inside the body after the age of 60, and most people never even notice it. Nothing dramatic, no sudden pain, no clear warning sign, just a subtle shift. The same pill you've been taking for years, the one that always felt safe, predictable, almost routine, can begin to behave differently. Not because the medication changed, but because your body did. And in some cases, that difference isn't small. It can quietly shift the balance between protection and risk, between stability and a slow buildup towards something far more serious, like a heart attack or a stroke. What makes this especially dangerous is how invisible it is. At first, everything feels normal. No alarms, no discomfort, just a silent change happening beneath the surface. And today, we're going to uncover 5 specific types of medications that, after the age of 60, have been linked to an increased risk of cardiovascular problems, especially when they're taken the same way they were years ago, without adjustment. But this is important. This isn't about fear. It's about understanding what's really happening inside your body right now, so you can make smarter, more informed decisions moving forward. Because once you see the full picture, you'll realize this isn't just about medication. It's about timing, context, and how your body evolves over time. To really understand why these risks increase after 60, you need to start with something most people are never told. Your body doesn't process medications the same way it used to, and this is where everything begins to change. As we age, several key systems in the body gradually slow down. The liver, which is responsible for breaking down many medications, becomes less efficient. The kidneys, which filter waste and excess substances from your blood, also lose some of their filtering capacity. What does that mean in real life? It means medications stay in your system longer, sometimes much longer than expected. And when that happens, even a normal dose can begin to act like a higher dose over time. But that's only part of the story. There's also a shift in how your blood vessels respond. Your arteries become less flexible, the inner lining becomes more sensitive, and circulation patterns begin to change. Even the balance between clotting and bleeding becomes more delicate. So when a medication interacts with any of these systems, the effect can be amplified. This is where people get misled, because the medication itself isn't necessarily dangerous. It may have been completely appropriate when it was first prescribed, and it might still be useful today. But the context has changed, and in medicine, context changes everything. Here's where it becomes more serious. After the age of 60, the baseline risk of cardiovascular events, like heart attacks and strokes, naturally increases. That part is well known. But what's often overlooked is what happens when certain medications are layered on top of that risk without being adjusted. Sometimes the increase is subtle. Other times, it's significant. And most of the time, it happens without any obvious symptoms until something finally goes wrong. This is why the conversation we're having today actually matters. Because we're not just talking about medications, we're talking about how your body interacts with them right now, at this stage of life, and more importantly, what you can do about it. Now, before we get into the first medications, there's one idea you need to keep in mind. None of this means you should stop anything on your own. That's not the goal. The goal is awareness, because when you understand how something works, you start asking better questions. You have more informed conversations, and you avoid staying on autopilot with something that may no longer fit your current physiology. And that's exactly where the first layer of risk begins, because the first 2 medications we're about to talk about are among the most commonly used and the most rarely questioned. Let's start with something incredibly common, a type of medication that many people take without a second thought, often for years, sometimes even decades. And yet, after 60, it can begin to behave very differently inside the body. The first category is known as non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or NSAIDs. This includes familiar names like ibuprofen, naproxen, and even some prescription-strength anti-inflammatory medications. They're widely used for joint pain, back pain, arthritis, and everyday inflammation. For many people, they feel like a simple solution. You take one, the pain eases, and you move on with your day. But inside the body, something more complex is happening. NSAIDs work by blocking specific enzymes involved in inflammation. That's what reduces pain. But those same enzymes also play a role in protecting your blood vessels and maintaining healthy blood flow. And this is where the issue begins. After 60, your blood vessels are already less flexible, and the inner lining of your arteries becomes more sensitive to stress. When NSAIDs interfere with that protective system, it can lead to a subtle tightening of blood vessels. Not something you feel immediately, but something that quietly begins to shift how your cardiovascular system functions. That tightening of blood vessels has consequences, and they're not always obvious right away. As vessels constrict, blood pressure begins to rise. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually and persistently. At the same time, NSAIDs can interfere with how your kidneys regulate fluid balance. They can cause your body to retain more sodium and water, which adds extra strain on the heart. Now you have two things happening at once: increased blood pressure and increased fluid load. And for someone over 60, where the cardiovascular system is already working harder than it used to, that combination matters more than most people realize. Multiple large-scale studies have shown that long-term or frequent use of NSAIDs is associated with a higher risk of heart attack and stroke, especially in older adults or those with existing cardiovascular risk factors. But here's where it becomes misleading. The relief is immediate. You feel better quickly. But the impact builds slowly, over time. You don't feel your blood pressure rising day by day. You don't notice the added strain on your arteries in real time. It accumulates quietly, and that's exactly why it often goes unnoticed until it becomes something more serious. Now here's the key point. This doesn't mean NSAIDs are inherently bad. It means they need to be used with awareness, especially after 60. Occasional use, short-term relief, or carefully monitored dosing may still be completely appropriate, but daily long-term use without reevaluation, that's where the risk begins to rise. And this brings us to the second medication, because this one is even more subtle and often even more underestimated. It's a class of drugs known as proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs. These include medications like omeprazole, esomeprazole, and other acid-reducing drugs. They're commonly prescribed for acid reflux, heartburn, and stomach protection, especially for people taking medications that may irritate the stomach. On the surface, they seem harmless. They reduce acid, relieve discomfort, and protect the stomach lining. Simple, effective, routine. But here's where things become less obvious. Stomach acid isn't just there to cause discomfort. It plays a critical role in absorbing key nutrients, including magnesium, calcium, and vitamin B12. And over time, long-term use of PPIs can quietly reduce the absorption of these essential nutrients, setting off a chain of effects that most people never connect back to the medication itself. At first, that nutrient imbalance doesn't seem directly connected to the heart, but over time, it absolutely is. Magnesium, for example, plays a critical role in maintaining a stable heart rhythm. When levels drop, the risk of irregular heartbeats can increase. Calcium is essential for proper vascular function, and vitamin B12 supports both nerve health and the integrity of blood vessels. When these levels are gradually disrupted, the cardiovascular system becomes more vulnerable, quietly, steadily, and often without clear symptoms. But there's another layer that makes this even more important. Some research suggests that long-term use of PPIs may affect the function of the endothelium, the inner lining of your blood vessels. This lining is responsible for regulating blood flow, controlling clotting, and helping vessels relax when needed. When it doesn't function properly, the risk of vascular events begins to rise. And just like before, this doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly, in the background. This is where many people get it wrong. They start a PPI for a short-term issue, like acid reflux or stomach irritation, but then continue taking it for years without ever reassessing whether it's still necessary. Because it feels safe. Because it was prescribed. Because nothing feels wrong. But that's exactly how these silent risks continue to grow unnoticed. And this is where things start to go deeper. Because the next category of medications doesn't just influence nutrient levels or blood pressure, it directly affects how your body functions under stress. The third group is benzodiazepines, medications commonly used for sleep, anxiety, or calming the nervous system. This includes drugs like diazepam, lorazepam, and similar prescriptions. They're effective, no question. They can reduce anxiety quickly and help with sleep when it feels out of reach. For many people, especially later in life, they feel like a necessary support. But underneath that calming effect, something else is happening. These medications act on the central nervous system, slowing down brain activity. But not just that. They also slow down reaction time, coordination, and even breathing patterns. And here's where the connection to cardiovascular risk begins. As the body ages, it becomes more sensitive to these effects. The medication stays in the system longer, accumulates more easily, and the sedative impact becomes stronger, even at the same dose. Over time, this can lead to reduced physical activity, less movement, and more time spent sitting or lying down. And that matters more than most people think, because circulation depends on movement. When movement decreases, blood flow becomes less efficient, and that's where risk begins to build quietly. When circulation slows down, the effects don't stay isolated. They begin to ripple through the entire system. Blood flow becomes less efficient, the risk of clot formation increases, and oxygen delivery to tissues becomes less optimal. But there's another layer that often goes unnoticed. Benzodiazepines can also affect breathing patterns during sleep. They may contribute to shallow breathing or worsen existing conditions like sleep apnea. And when oxygen levels drop repeatedly, BMHLKH the night, even slightly, it places additional strain on the heart. Now combine that with reduced movement during the day, and you have a system that's under more stress than it appears on the surface. What makes this so misleading is how it feels. It doesn't feel dangerous. It feels like fatigue, like slower mornings, like what many people assume is just a normal part of aging. But underneath, the cardiovascular system is working harder to compensate. And over time, those small, consistent pressures can increase the risk of serious events, especially when combined with other factors like high blood pressure or existing vascular conditions. Now let's move to the fourth category, because this is where things become even more complex. Not just because of what the medication does, but because of how it interacts with everything else you might be taking. The fourth category includes certain decongestants and stimulant-like medications, commonly used for colds, sinus congestion, or seasonal allergies. Many of these contain ingredients like pseudoephedrine and are often available over the counter, which makes them feel harmless. But their mechanism is very different from what we've discussed so far. These medications work by constricting blood vessels. That's how they reduce swelling in the nasal passages. The problem is that effect doesn't stay limited to the nose. It happens throughout the body, including in the vessels connected to the heart. As those vessels tighten, blood pressure rises, heart rate can increase, and the heart has to work harder to push blood through a narrower system. In a younger body, this is often tolerated. But after 60, when arteries are already less flexible, that added strain can become significant, especially when combined with other medications. And that's the key issue: combination. Many people aren't taking just one medication, they're taking several. A pain reliever, something for sleep, something for blood pressure, and then a decongestant gets added on top. Individually, each one may seem manageable, but together, they begin to interact in ways that increase overall cardiovascular stress. And this is where things can shift from subtle to serious, often without warning.